Wyoming Territory, January 1878. The wind cut like a blade across the high plains, and Franklin Lattimer pulled his coat tighter as he urged his horse down the snow-packed trail. He had been trailing a runaway calf since dawn, but it was late afternoon now, and the sun was slipping behind the ridge. He was about to turn back when he saw movement near a frozen creek bed by the cottonwoods. A woman. She was bent low under the weight of a wooden bucket, her arms trembling as she trudged through knee-deep snow. A blanket was wrapped tight around her shoulders, and in her left arm she cradled a bundled baby close to her chest. Her boots were soaked through, the hem of her dress dark with meltwater and ice. Franklin dismounted without thinking. "Ma'am," he called, his voice firm but not loud. "You keep going like that, you'll freeze before you get back." The woman turned fast, startled, but she did not back away. Her face was pale, lips blue at the edges, but her eyes, green and fierce, locked on his. "I do not need help," she said through chattering teeth. "I only need water for my baby." He stepped closer, snow crunching under his boots. The baby let out a soft whimper, barely loud enough to rise above the wind. Franklin glanced at the bucket in her hand, the ice forming at its rim, and then back at her. "Let me carry you both." She hesitated, arms tightening around the child. "I have a cabin up the ridge just a mile," he said. "It is warm, there is food, and a fire." She blinked, and her lip trembled, not from cold this time, but something else. She gave a small nod, and Franklin took the bucket from her hand, setting it down in the snow. Then gently he reached for her. "I can walk," she said, her voice quieter now. "I know," he said, "but I am carrying you anyway." She did not argue again. Franklin lifted her with an ease that surprised them both, then tucked the baby closer against her chest as he settled her in front of him on the saddle. She leaned back into him without a word, her head resting against his shoulder, and he wrapped his coat around all three of them. "What is your name?" he asked as they rode. "Keziah Norwood," he nodded. "I am Franklin Lattimer." They rode in silence through the drifts, the horses' hooves muffled by snow. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk had turned the sky a deep blue, and a thin line of smoke curled up from the chimney. Inside, Franklin moved fast. He laid a thick quilt near the fire and set Keziah down with the baby. He added wood to the stove, then filled a kettle and set it to boil. "You are not from around here," he said as he pulled off his gloves. Keziah shook her head. "We came from Kansas. My husband died 3 months back." Her voice caught, but she didn't stop. "We had no family left. I went looking for work. Ended up stranded in the snow." Franklin crouched down beside her. Up close he could see the baby's face, round, red-cheeked, wrapped in layers of old flannel. "What is the little one's name?" "Hattie," she whispered. "She is 6 months." He looked at the child, then back at her. "You should have come to town. There is a church there. Folks would have helped." "I did not want pity," she said, her jaw tightening. "I just needed water." Franklin stood and moved to prepare food, a pot of beans, some cornbread, and coffee. He watched her from the corner of his eye, how she reached for her baby with care, how she stayed silent but alert, her shoulders tense like she was waiting for the world to take more from her. "You do not have to prove anything," he said quietly. She looked up. "You made it this far. That says enough." Her eyes softened, and for the first time since he met her, her mouth turned in the faintest smile. They ate in quiet. Hattie slept in a wooden cradle Franklin had not used in years, tucked close to the stove. Keziah sat across from him by the fire, her dress drying, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. "You live here alone?" she asked. He nodded. "My folks passed. Brother moved east. I stayed. Cattle and land keep me busy." She looked around the cabin, simple, clean, quiet. "It is peaceful. I like quiet." She gave a slow nod. "So do I." That night, Franklin laid out a cot by the stove for Keziah and the baby. He made sure the fire was banked and the windows shut tight before turning in on his own bed across the room. He did not sleep much. He kept listening for Hattie's breath, for the shift of Keziah's weight as she turned under the quilt. Something about the quiet had changed. It was not empty anymore. In the morning, Keziah stood at the stove, her back straight, cooking eggs without being asked. "You are my guest," Franklin said as he stepped beside her. "I can still help," she said. He just nodded. They ate together again. Afterward, he saddled his horse and brought in more wood while Keziah mended a tear in her shawl. She was not afraid of work, and she did not speak unless she had something to say. He liked that. Late in the afternoon, she stood near the window, her arms crossed. "I should move on tomorrow," she said. Franklin lowered the log he had been stacking. "You could stay a little longer." "Until things warm up." She turned to face him. "You do not know me. You carried a baby through snow and ice to get her water. That is all I need to know." Her eyes filled, but she blinked fast and looked away. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not." She stared at him for a long moment. "I do not know if I remember how to trust anyone." Franklin walked over, slow and calm. He stopped a step away from her. "Then we will take it one day at a time." She looked up at him. "And if I forget how to hope," he reached out, brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his hand steady. "Then I will carry that too." Keziah swallowed hard, and this time she did not look away. Outside, the wind still howled over the ridge, but inside the cabin it was warm. Hattie slept safe, and for the first time in a long time, Keziah did not feel alone. The snow held through February, dense and heavy, and Keziah stayed. Franklin didn't ask her to, not again. He simply kept making space for her in the rhythm of his days. She rose early, saw to Hattie, then helped with whatever needed doing. She cleaned out the root cellar without being prompted, folded linens he hadn't touched in years, and knew how to dry sagebrush for kindling so it caught even when the logs were damp. Franklin watched her hands more than he meant to how she stitched seams without wasting thread, how she rubbed Hattie's back in slow circles until the baby drifted off, how she dug her fingers into bread dough like she was grounding herself. There was something in the way she moved, quiet but exacting, like she'd learned to survive by doing everything right the first time. One morning, while the wind rattled the stovepipe and the coffee boiled low, Keziah set down a plate in front of him and sat across the table without a word. She didn't look tired anymore, just worn in the way people got when they'd had to carry too much too long. "Did you always want cattle?" she asked, eyes on the frost along the window pane. "I needed something that didn't mind being left alone," he said. "Steers don't ask questions. They just keep moving." "That sounds lonely." It was. She didn't answer right away. Hattie stirred in her cradle, then settled again. Keziah's fingers curled around the edge of her tin cup. "My mother died when I was 13, she said finally. "My father remarried within the year. His new wife didn't want me, so I married the first man who said I was worth something." Franklin didn't interrupt. He was kind at first. Then the drought came and the baby. He stopped looking me in the eye, got sick fast. I buried him before frost hit the ground. Never cried. Franklin rested his forearm on the table. That wasn't weakness, it was surviving. Keziah met his gaze. "Sometimes I think I forgot how to feel anything at all." "You didn't forget. You just had no room for it." That evening, Franklin saddled the mule and loaded it with sacks of oats and dried apples. Keziah watched from the steps, Hattie bundled against her chest. "I'm riding into town," he said. "You need anything?" "What's it like there?" "Loud, cramped. But there's a mercantile and a doctor. A few decent folks." She glanced down at Hattie. "I could write a letter to my sister. She's in Missouri now. I haven't told her anything since August." He handed her a scrap of paper and a pencil stub from the shelf. I'll post it for you." When he returned 2 days later, the cabin was warm and clean. A kettle simmered with beans and smoked pork. Keziah met him at the door with a wool scarf she'd finished knitting from leftover yarn. "I traded for some new boots," he said, setting down the parcel. "Yours were leaking." She looked at the package, then at him. "You didn't have to, I know." That night, as Hattie slept soundly, Keziah stood by the window, hands pressed to the pane. Franklin watched her from the table where he carved a new handle for the drawknife. "She still hasn't caught a cough," she said. "Even with all the cold, you're keeping her warm." Keziah turned. "I didn't think I'd be good at this, mothering, but I don't think she's ever been afraid." "She doesn't need to be," he said. Keziah crossed the room, slow, thoughtful. She sat across from him, her knees brushing his. "You ever wish things had gone different?" she asked. "I used to. Now I just want them to go forward." She looked down at the handle in his hands. "You're patient. I'm steady. That's rarer." Franklin set the knife aside. He didn't touch her, didn't move closer, but his voice came low, even. "You don't have to outrun everything anymore." She nodded once, eyes bright, and for the first time she looked like someone who believed she might not have to. Outside, the wind had died. The snow lightened and the trees stood still under the stars. Inside the cabin, warm lamplight stretched long across the floor, and Keziah sat quietly beside him, as if she'd finally found a place to rest. By March, the thaw had begun. The snow pulled back from the hilltops first, leaving patches of slick mud and flattened grass. The days stretched a little longer, light lingering in the sky even as Franklin lit the lamp inside. And though the air still carried winter's breath, something had shifted in the silence between them, something steady, like water easing into thawed ground. Keziah had started tending a small plot near the barn, breaking up the frozen crust with a rusted hand hoe Franklin hadn't used in years. She worked slow, deliberate, her skirts tucked high and her sleeves rolled. Hattie sat nearby in a wooden crate lined with wool, gnawing on a clothespin while her mother turned soil. "You can wait for the frost to pass," Franklin said from the fence rail, arms folded. "I'd rather be early than idle," she said, not looking up. He studied the line of her back, the way her shoulders moved like she was used to lifting more than the earth. "What are you planting?" "Turnips. Maybe collards if the seed's still good," he nodded. "You'll want to fence it." "Mule deer come down from the ridge soon as the snow gives way." She straightened, wiped her brow with the edge of her sleeve. "I figured you'd say that. I already cut some branches behind the shed." That night, while Hattie chewed on a crust of bread in her cradle, Keziah sat at the table with Franklin, her fingers stained with dirt, her hair pulled back with a strip of muslin. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, eyes on the flicker of the lamp. "I did once," Franklin said. "When my brother left, thought maybe I ought to go too, but the land knew my name better than any place else. I used to think Missouri was the whole world, then Kansas felt like a punishment. Out here." Her voice trailed off and she traced the rim of her cup. "Out here, I'm not sure what to call it yet. You don't have to name it right away." She gave a faint, short breath. "I'm not used to taking time." Franklin's voice was low. "You're allowed to." Outside, the coyotes had gone quiet and the wind moved soft through the eaves. Franklin watched her fingers still against the tin. Then she looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes, not the sharp vigilance he'd first seen, but something that asked if she was allowed to want more. The next morning, Franklin found her sitting on the porch with her mending in her lap, Hattie asleep against her chest. She didn't speak until he sat down beside her and stretched his legs toward the yard. "Did you know I was coming down that creek bed that day?" she asked. "I saw the tracks. Figured it was a calf at first. I almost turned back. The cold was worse than I thought." Her voice was quiet, but she needed the water. Franklin looked out toward the cottonwoods. "You didn't turn back." I was shaking so bad I couldn't feel my hands. He didn't answer, only reached into his coat pocket and passed her a folded scrap of paper. Her fingers stilled. "Your sister wrote back." Keziah took the letter, held it without opening it. "I don't know what she'll say. You'll find out when you're ready." She sat still for a long moment, then tucked the letter into her apron. "Do you think a person can start over without forgetting everything behind them?" Franklin's gaze stayed on the far fence line. "I think if you carry it right, it makes you stronger, but you've got to set it down sometimes too. I don't know how. You're doing it." Keziah looked down at Hattie, then back at him. "You don't ask for much. I've had enough taken to know what I'd rather give." That night, she didn't sleep on the cot. She didn't ask, and he didn't question it. She laid Hattie in the cradle, then crossed the room and stood beside his bed. Franklin sat up, feet flat on the floor, his hands resting on his knees. "I'm not coming to you because I'm afraid," she said. "Not because I'm cold or lost." He looked up into her face, steady and quiet. "Then why?" "Because I want to be where I feel safe." He rose without a word and opened the quilts. When she lay beside him, he didn't reach for her, only let her settle. Her head fit beneath his chin. Her breath slowed against his chest. And for the first time since he buried his father, Franklin slept through the night. The next morning brought birdsong, thin and hesitant, from the bare branches near the barn. Keziah stood at the stove, skin bare at the nape of her neck, hair plaited and tied with twine. She turned when he approached, and he saw a quiet certainty in her face. "Once the ground softens," she said, "we should build a second room for Hattie." Franklin reached for the coffee pot. "We can start tomorrow." She smiled, not the kind that tried to convince itself, but the kind that came from a place already decided. He poured them each a cup. "You and her, you stay as long as you want." Keziah's hand brushed his as she took hers. "Then I'll be here for good." By late April, the ground had loosened enough for fence posts and turned beds. Franklin drove them in one by one, the rhythm of the post maul steady and low while Keziah followed behind, tying wire with hands made deft from years of doing without. Hattie lay shaded nearby beneath a flower-sack canopy strung between fence rails, gurgling at the clouds as they passed. The work passed quietly, save for the creak of wood and the low calls of a meadowlark nesting near the shed. Franklin paused to wipe sweat from his brow, glancing toward the new corner of the garden where Keziah was already laying neat rows of onion sets. She had not asked permission, only set to it with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything these days. "You ever miss city noise?" he asked, shifting his weight onto the post driver. Keziah didn't look up. "I never lived where the streets were more than dust and planks. Closest I got to a town was a meatpacking stop near Topeka. Smelled like blood and lye." Franklin leaned against the fence rail. "Sounds like hell." It was worse when the wind turned. She dusted her hands and stood, brushing the back of her skirt. "But I could buy a bolt of calico for 6 cents less than in the dry goods store." "You always think in numbers." "Only when numbers kept me fed." He nodded, chewing over her words like he might a dry biscuit. "I never learned thrift. My mother handled coin. I just kept the tools oiled and the stock alive." "Well," Keziah said, picking up the last bundle of seed, "you've done enough that I haven't gone hungry." That night, Keziah folded a wool blanket and placed it across the end of Franklin's bed without saying why. When he turned from the wash basin, she was already in her nightdress, reading by the firelight. Her hair was still damp from a basin rinse, and her feet tucked beneath her like she'd always belonged in that chair. "You plan everything out ahead of time," Franklin said, drying his hands. "Only what I can't afford to lose," she replied. Franklin sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "What made you leave Missouri?" he asked. "Before Kansas." Keziah closed the book and rested it on her lap. "My father was a blacksmith. Had a twisted leg from the war but still worked iron like it was bread dough. He died from a lung infection when I was 16. After that, the shop went to debt." She didn't look away. "I married a man who said he could pull us out of it, but he only pulled us west, said it was for land. Truth is, he just wanted to outrun what he owed." Franklin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Keziah traced the edge of the wool with her thumb. "I buried him in a hickory box he never built, on land he never paid for." Franklin let the silence settle a while before answering. "You deserve roots that don't shift beneath you." Her eyes met his. "You offering. I'm building something I'd rather not finish alone." They didn't touch. They didn't move. But something between them settled deeper than before, like an iron bracket finally fitted flush. The following week, Franklin hitched the cart and drove the three of them to the far pasture where the creek split through a stand of willows. It was the first time Keziah left the cabin since the thaw, and she sat close beside him, Hattie on her lap, the baby's bonnet tied snug against the breeze. They picnicked in the tall grass while the horse grazed nearby. Franklin handed Keziah half a boiled egg and leaned back on his elbows. "You ever think about marrying again?" he asked, watching the clouds. Keziah tore off a piece of bread and handed it to Hattie. "I used to think I didn't deserve a second try. And now, I think. Maybe I was just with the wrong man the first time." Franklin turned his head and met her gaze. "You're not alone anymore, Keziah." She laid a hand on his, fingers worn but warm. "I know." That night she moved closer beneath the quilt, not out of need but choice. And when Franklin curled his hand around hers, she didn't flinch or pull away. Outside, the frogs had returned to the marshes, their calls low and rhythmic under the stars. Inside, the fire burned low, and the three of them slept in a peace earned one fence post, one seed, one breath at a time. May came with early rains and the sound of frogs thick down by the creek. The garden pushed up thin green shoots, and Franklin's cattle moved slower in the warming light. He and Keziah rose each day with the sun, no longer out of habit or necessity, but because it gave them more time together. They didn't speak of what they were building, it was already understood. One morning, Franklin brought in a bucket of nails and a saw, setting them down beside the cabin's east wall. Keziah, brushing flour from her hands, eyed the planks he'd laid out. "You're aiming to do it today," he nodded. "Sky's clear. Ground soft enough to dig a line for the foundation." She stepped outside, arms crossed against the breeze. "I thought we'd wait until after branding. You said she'd need her own room." He looked over at the cradle where Hattie cooed, her feet kicking against the quilt. "I don't see why she should wait." Keziah touched the lintel above the door. "You always move like you've already made peace with the work." Franklin shrugged. "I don't see sense in dragging my feet." That afternoon, she stood beside him, holding the board steady while he drove each nail. The child napped inside, the door left open for breeze and sound. Keziah didn't speak much, but every time she handed him another length of timber, she met his eye with something more settled than she'd ever worn before. As the frame rose and the shadows shifted, she tugged her shawl tighter and leaned against the half-raised wall. "You ever think about what kind of father you'd be?" she asked. Franklin wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Not until lately," she waited. "I reckon I'd be plain-spoken. I'd teach her to handle a horse before she could spell it." He glanced toward the cabin. "And I'd never let her go to sleep wondering if she was wanted." Keziah's voice caught in her throat, but she didn't look away. That night they sat close on the porch bench, the baby asleep just behind the screen door. The sky hung low and violet, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. Keziah folded her hands in her lap. I've thought a lot about what kind of wife I was. You don't owe anyone judgment, Franklin said. I'm not judging, just trying to name what was mine and what wasn't. He waited. I stayed small so I wouldn't be hit. I stayed quiet so I wouldn't be left, and still I was both. Franklin's jaw tightened, but he stayed still. I don't want to be small anymore, she said. He reached over, his hand warm and calloused as it closed over hers. You never were. She leaned in slow, laying her head against his shoulder. I want to be with someone who sees the whole of me, not just what I carry. I do, he said simply. I know. Behind them, Hattie stirred once, then quieted again. The wind shifted from the south, warm against the porch beams. By the end of June, the addition stood finished. Keziah had sewn curtains from muslin scraps, and Franklin carved a cedar rail for the child's bed. One evening, she stood in the doorway of the new room, arms crossed, watching Hattie sleep. She won't remember the hard parts, she said. Franklin stood beside her, his hand resting at her back. But she'll know peace came after. The next Sunday, they rode the wagon into town. She wore a blue dress Franklin hadn't seen before, and Hattie clutched a straw doll Keziah had stitched from leftover batting. Franklin handed the reins to the stable boy and offered his arm. Inside the church, the preacher greeted them without surprise. I heard you were building something out there, he said. Franklin nodded. Still are. The preacher's eyes flicked to Keziah, then to Hattie. You ready to make it official? Keziah looked at Franklin. I am. Franklin met her gaze. So am I. They married that same afternoon in the shade of the chapel's cottonwood, with dust rising from the road and swallows circling overhead. No guests but the preacher, the baby in Keziah's arms, and the promise between them. When they returned home, Franklin lifted Keziah down from the wagon with both hands, steady and sure. She leaned into him for a breath longer than needed, sunlight catching in her hair. He touched her cheek. You're home now. I know, she said, her voice low. And I'm staying. That night they laid together in the still air, the window open to the sound of crickets. Keziah's fingers traced the line of Franklin's arm, her breath slow and even beside him. He turned toward her, brushing her hair from her face. You're not what I expected, he said. She smiled. Neither are you. He kissed her, then not rushed, not uncertain, just steady like everything else he did. They woke the next morning to birdsong and the scent of bread rising. Hattie babbled from her crib, and Keziah reached for Franklin's hand across the quilt. Years passed, but the rhythm held. The garden grew deeper roots, and so did they. Hattie learned to walk in the tall grass behind the barn, her fingers curled around Franklin's thumb. Keziah taught her to boil jam and mend seams, her voice softer than it used to be. Franklin built a second cradle when their next child came, a boy born in the quiet of a September night, with Keziah's hand wrapped tight around his. They named him Elias, after her father. No harsh winds ever came that they could not weather. The land stayed, the house stood, and the family within it grew not just in size, but in peace. And when Keziah looked at Franklin across the dinner table, with two children laughing and the fire warm behind them, she knew she had not just survived, she had come home.